before Hester Prynne could gather voice enough to attract his observation. At length she succeeded. "Arthur Dimmesdale," she said, faintly at first, then louder, but hoarsely. "Arthur Dimmesdale!" "Who speaks?" answered the minister. Gathering himself quickly up, he stood more erect, like a man taken by surprise in a mood to which he was reluctant to have witnesses. Throwing his eyes anxiously in the direction of the voice, he indistinctly beheld a form under the trees, clad in garments so somber and so little relieved from the gray twilight into which the clouded sky and the heavy foliage had darkened the noontide, that he knew not whether it were a woman or a shadow. It may be that his pathway through life was haunted thus by a spectre that had stolen out from among his thoughts. Interesting that he can't tell Hester if she's a woman or a shadow, which might allude to the fact that maybe she's become more of a shadow of the woman she used to be. He made a step nigher and discovered the scarlet letter. "Hester! Hester Prynne," said he, "is it thou? Art thou in life?" "Even so," she answered. "In such life has been mine these 7 years past. And thou, Arthur Dimmesdale, dost thou yet live?" It was no wonder that they thus questioned one another's actual and bodily existence, and even doubted of their own. So strangely did they meet in the dim wood that it was like the first encounter in the world beyond the grave of two spirits who had been intimately connected in their former life, but now stood coldly, shuddering in mutual dread, as not yet familiar with their state, nor wonted to the companionship of disembodied beings. Each a ghost and awe-stricken at the other ghost, they were awe-stricken likewise at themselves, because the crisis flung back to them their consciousness, and revealed to each heart its history and experience, as life never does, except at such breathless epochs. The soul beheld its features in the mirror of the passing moment. It was with fear and tremulously, and as it were by a slow, reluctant necessity, that Arthur Dimmesdale put forth his hand, chill as death, and touched at the chill hand of Hester Prynne. The grasp, cold as it was, took away what was dreariest in the interview. They now felt themselves, at least, inhabitants of the same sphere. So a few things happening here. We once again have a mention of a mirror, which makes us think about reflection and what they could be reflecting upon or what they're seeing in one another. And we also have a lot of mention of ghosts, former lives, chilled hands. What could this all be telling us? What could it imply about both Hester and Dimmesdale? Without a word more spoken, neither he nor she assuming the guidance, but with an unexpressed consent, they glided back into the shadow of the woods whence Hester had emerged, and sat down on a heap of moss where she and Pearl had before been sitting. When they found voice to speak, it was at first only to utter remarks and inquiries such as any two acquaintances might have made, about the gloomy sky, the threatening storm, and next, the health of each. So basically they're having some small talk here, right? Thus they went onward, not boldly, but step by step, into the themes that were brooding deepest into their hearts. So long estranged by fate and circumstances, they needed something slight and casual to run before and throw open the doors of intercourse, so that their real thoughts might be led across the threshold. Lots of talks about thresholds here, too. What could that mean? After a while, the minister fixed his eyes on Hester Prynne's. "Hester," said he, "hast thou found peace?" She smiled drearily, looking down upon her bosom. "Hast thou?" she asked. "None, nothing but despair," he answered. "What else could I look for, being what I am, and leading such a life as mine? Were I an atheist, a man devoid of conscience, a wretch with coarse and brutal instincts, I might have found peace long ere now. Nay, I never should have lost it. But as matters stand with my soul, whatever of good capacity there originally was in me, all of God's gifts that were the choicest have become the ministers of spiritual torment. Hester, I am most miserable." "The people reverence thee," said Hester, "and surely thou workest good among them. Doth this bring thee no comfort?" "More misery, Hester, only the more misery," answered the clergyman with a bitter smile. "As concerns the good which I may appear to do, I have no faith in it. It must needs be a delusion. What can a ruined soul like mine effect towards the redemption of other souls, or a polluted soul toward their purification? And as for the people's reverence, would that it were turned to scorn and hatred. Canst thou deem it, Hester, a consolation that I must stand up in my pulpit and meet so many eyes turned upward to my face, as if the light of heaven were beaming from it? Must see my flock hungry for the truth, and listening to my words as if a tongue of Pentecost were speaking? And then look inward, and discern the black reality of what they idolize? I have laughed in bitterness and agony of heart as the contrast between what I seem and what I am, and Satan laughs at it." "You wrong yourself in this," said Hester gently. "You have deeply and sorely repented. Your sin is left behind you in the days long past. Your present life is not less holy in very truth than it seems in people's eyes. Is there no reality in the penitence thus sealed and witnessed by good works? And wherefore should it not bring you peace?" "No, Hester, no," replied the clergyman. "There is no substance in it. It is cold and dead and can do nothing for me. Of penance I have had enough. Of penitence there has been none. Else I should long ago have thrown off these garments of mock holiness and have shown myself to mankind as they will see me at the judgment seat. Happy are you, Hester, that wear the scarlet letter openly upon your bosom. Mine burns in secret. Thou little know'st what a relief it is, after the torment of a 7 years' cheat, to look into an eye that recognizes me for what I am. Had I one friend, or were it my worst enemy, to whom when sickened with the praises of all other men I could daily betake myself, and known as the vilest of all sinners, methinks my soul might keep itself alive thereby. Even thus much of truth would save me. But now it is all falsehood, all emptiness, all death." Hester Prynne looked into his face, but hesitated to speak. Yet uttering his long-restrained emotions so vehemently as he did, his words here offered her the very point of circumstances in which to interpose what she came to say. She conquered her fears and spoke. So do you remember what she was going to say? She had talked to Chillingworth earlier. "Such a friend as thou hast even now wished for," said she, "with whom to weep over thy sin, thou hast in me the partner of it." Again she hesitated, but brought out the words with an effort. "Thou hast long had such an enemy, and dwellest with him under the same roof." The minister started to his feet, gasping for breath, and clutching at his heart, as if he would have torn it out of his bosom. "Ha! What sayest thou?" cried he. "An enemy, and under mine own roof? What mean you?" Hester Prynne was now fully sensible of the deep injury for which she was responsible to this unhappy man in permitting him to lie for so many years, or indeed for a single moment, at the mercy of one whose purposes could not be other than malevolent. The very contingency of his enemy, beneath whatever mask the latter might conceal himself, was enough to disturb the magnetic sphere of a being so sensitive as Arthur Dimmesdale. There had been a period when Hester was less alive to this consideration. Or perhaps, in the misanthropy of her own trouble, she left the minister to bear what she might picture to herself as a more tolerable doom. But of late, since the night of his vigil, all her sympathies toward him had been both softened and invigorated. She now read his heart more accurately. She doubted not the continual presence of Roger Chillingworth, the secret poison of his malignity, infecting all the air about him, and his authorized interference as a physician with the minister's physical and spiritual infirmities, and these bad opportunities had been turned to a cruel purpose. By means of them, the sufferer's conscience had been kept in an irritated state, the tendency of which was, not to cure by wholesome pain, but to disorganize and corrupt for spiritual being. Its result on earth could hardly fail to be insanity, and herefore that eternal alienation from the good and true, of which madness is perhaps the earthly type. So, what is this saying? Basically, she's saying that she felt like he was better off being kept out of the situation. So she was thinking she was kind of taking the brunt of the punishment by wearing the A. Everybody knows about it. So she's the only one that can be punished. So she kind of thought that she was keeping him safe by not telling anyone. But in reality, she's starting to think that he actually had a harder time because he had to hold this big secret in. He had to hold on to all of his sin. Where she could be outwardly punished, he felt like he was the only person responsible for punishing himself. Such was the ruin to which she had brought the man once. Nay, why should we not speak of it? Still so passionately loved. Hester felt that the sacrifice of the clergyman's good name and death itself, as she had already told Roger Chillingworth, would have been infinitely preferable to the alternative which she had taken upon herself to choose. And now, rather than have had his grievous wrong to confess, she would gladly have laid down on the forest leaves and died there, at Arthur Dimmesdale's feet. So we find out one important thing in this last little paragraph. She admits, or at least through the narrator, admits that not only did she once love him, but she still does. "Oh, Arthur," cried she, "forgive me. In all things else I have striven to be true. Truth was the one virtue which I might have held fast, and did hold fast through all extremity, save when thy good, thy life, thy fame were put in question. Then I consented to a deception. But a lie is never good, even though death threaten on the other side. Dost thou not see what I would say? That old man, the physician, he whom they call Roger Chillingworth, he was my husband." The minister looked at her for an instant, with all that violence of passion, which, intermixed in more shapes than one with his higher, purer, softer qualities, was in fact the portion of him which the devil claimed, and though which he sought to win the rest. Never was there a blacker or fiercer frown than Hester now encountered. For the brief space that it lasted, it was a dark transfiguration. But his character had been so much enfeebled by suffering that even its lower energies were pale, weak, sinful, and sorrow-stricken man that was what Hester could not bear and live. "Wilt thou yet forgive me?" she repeated over and over again. "Wilt thou not frown? Wilt thou forgive?" "I do forgive you, Hester," replied the minister at length, with a deep utterance out of an abyss of sadness, but no anger. "I freely forgive you now. May God forgive us both. We are not, Hester, the worst sinners in the world. There is one worse than even the polluted priest. That old man's revenge has been blacker than my sin. He has violated in cold blood the sanctity of the human heart. Thou and I, Hester, never did so." "Never, never," whispered she. "What we did had a consecration of its own. We felt it so. We said so to each other. Hast thou forgotten it?" "Hush, Hester," said Arthur Dimmesdale, rising from the ground. "No, I have not forgotten." They sat down again, side by side, and hand clasped in hand, on the mossy trunk of the fallen tree. Life had never brought them a gloomier hour. It was the point whither their pathway had so long been tending and darkening ever, as it stole along, and yet it unclosed a charm that made them linger upon it, and claim another, and after all, another moment. The forest was obscure around them and creaked with a blast that was passing through it. The boughs were tossing heavily above their heads, while one solemn old tree groaned dolefully to another, as if telling the sad story of the pair that sat beneath, or constrained to forebode evil to come. And yet they lingered. How dreary looked the forest track that led backward to the settlement, where Hester Prynne must take up again the burden of her ignominy, and the minister the hollow mockery of his good name. So they lingered an instant longer. No golden light had ever been so precious as the gloom of this dark forest. Here seen only